Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to stand today to speak to the budget. But first, I want to acknowledge the support of the people of Random-Burin-St. George's. I'm honored again to have the privilege to represent them. This is the second time they've elected me in this federal capacity. I've represented part of the riding in the district of Grand Bank for 12 years. So this is a continuation of the opportunity again to represent those constituents. Random-Burin-St. George is very much a rural riding. It has 180 communities, and it spreads from one end of the province to the other. So for anyone to have some kind of understanding and appreciation for the riding, you really have to travel there. I have 8 isolated communities, and you can only get to them by ferry. So to campaign in a riding like Random-Burin-St. George's takes a lot of effort, but it's important to do so, and especially to get to the very rural communities of the 180 in total. And I guess it's because of my riding being so rural that I have a real appreciation for the lack of jobs in those very small communities, for any kind of measure that would be taken that would impact on those jobs or those services that are in fact being supplied in rural communities, and especially federal services, because sometimes what you'll find is that people think it's very easy to cut federal services in a very small town, that really there isn't a lot of flack that comes forward as a result of cutting a federal service in a small town, because they're thinking that, well, you know, few people really can't, few people really can't be too much of a concern. They certainly won't have an impact in terms of their protest about the closure of any kind of federal facility. And I think that's a wrong way to approach the removal of services, particularly federal services in this case. And when I look at what's happening in the budget with respect to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, I am really surprised. But I guess disappointed is a better word, because it clearly shows that there is no appreciation or no understanding for how important the fishery is to the economy of Canada, not just to Newfoundland and Labrador, not just to the Atlantic provinces, not just to the Pacific coast, but to the entire country. Because obviously any type of spin-off, any type of realization of income from any part of the region impacts on other parts of Canada. So when I look at what's being proposed for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans over 3 years, what's being talked about is over $80 million being cut from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Now, for me, that's a serious issue, and I think is one that must be responded to, must be addressed, and must be brought to the attention of anyone who's willing to listen, especially this Conservative government. Again, I have to speak to the fact that it would appear that they have no understanding or realization of how important the fishery is to the entire country, especially when we talk about fish as a product and as a source of food, and the protein when you talk about fish. But you know what really was bothersome to me was that when I looked at some of the commentary around the reduction from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and the blanket commentary when they talk about trying to create more effective service, trying to create efficiencies in the system. But one line that really bothered me was that they're doing this to focus on the government's priorities. Well, Mr. Speaker, I have a real issue with that. If you're going to remove in excess of $80 million from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, my first question is, what about the priorities of the fishers? What about the priorities of the industry? Was there any consultation that took place? They're talking about doing a strategic review, yet they've identified the amount of money that has to be removed from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Well, if you're going to do a strategic review and you've already identified that amount of money to be removed, you must have at some point in time decided where that money would come from, what services would be impacted, what jobs would be lost. Yet we're told that the strategic review hasn't even taken place, but they're going to cut that amount of money from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So that's a concern for me because it will impact on services. It will impact on jobs. Just like cutting money from ACOA, Canadian Opportunities Agency. That's a real issue for us in Atlantic Canada. That is our economic development engine. So the money that's being flowed through ACOA from the Conservative government, or from any government for that matter, is money that's used for economic development, especially in small communities where they really don't have access to government funding in terms of grants. They don't have access to money from banks. They look to ACOA to partner with them in terms of trying to create employment and trying to put some infrastructure in place. So those are serious issues that are going to impact on the people in Atlantic Canada when you're talking about removing in excess of $31 million from ACOA. Jobs are going to be impacted. People's lives are going to be impacted. Economic development is going to be impacted. Those are all serious issues. Let's look at Marine Atlantic. Marine Atlantic services the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador, actually, the ferry lands in my riding in Port aux Basques. So if you're looking at that, it's really the extension of the Trans-Canada Highway. That's how we view Marine Atlantic. So when I'm looking at Marine Atlantic and seeing a cut of $5.4 million over 3 years, clearly jobs are going to be impacted. Services are going to be impacted. Yet they don't identify what those services are going to be. So what have they done? They've created a crisis among employees who really don't know whether or not they're going to have jobs because they don't know what services are going to be impacted. This is a serious issue for us in Newfoundland and Labrador, just as it's a serious issue for the people in Nova Scotia, when you consider that that is, in fact, an extension of our Trans-Canada Highway. Those are serious issues. When you're removing that amount of money without consultation, when you say you're going to do a strategic review, but you haven't consulted on that, how can you just carte blanche say you're going to remove that amount of money from these particular entities, and these three impact so negatively on Newfoundland and Labrador? I look at what's happening with rural post offices, another serious issue for us. Here we're looking at the hours being cut of employees in rural post offices, yet the government says it has a moratorium on the closure of post offices in rural communities. Well, you can have a moratorium on the closure of post offices, but you're going to end up impacting on the service that you're providing if you're going to reduce the number of hours. And again, what does that mean? It means that federal services are being impacted. These are serious issues. Again, let's look at the Marine Centre, the Marine Safety Sub-Centre in St. John's. You're going to move what the minister regrettably called a call centre to Nova Scotia. Now, I have no problem with moving anything, but you can't move things without consulting and talking and finding out if it's the right thing to do. And clearly, this is not the right thing to do. It's a distress centre. There are 10,000 miles of coastline around Newfoundland. And if we don't realize what this means in terms of moving that distress centre, the service offered through that distress centre, out of Newfoundland and Labrador, then you do not understand the importance of marine safety. This is not about just fishers. This is about anybody who utilizes the waterways as a highway, whether it's tourists, whether it's other business other than fishers. A lot of trade takes place. A lot of boats come into Newfoundland and Labrador. These, again, are issues that somehow no one has taken into account the impact of going down this path. So if you're going to look at strategic review exercise, if you're going to look at trying to find ways of saving money, for heaven's sake, you should work with those who are going to be impacted. Because the Conservative government, we have a debt, the largest debt in our history.
That's right. Tons of debt.
We're looking at $56 million. Now, if you're looking at a debt of that magnitude, then the issue for us is the people of Newfoundland and Labrador or Atlantic Canada or Canada at large did not create that debt. So don't put burdens on their back in trying to solve it. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for her discussion here today and welcome her back to the House of Commons and congratulate her on her re-election. However, Mr. Speaker, I would like to correct the record on maybe a couple of points. I probably don't have enough time for all of it, but one I think that concerns me the most is the misrepresentation on the Marine Station Subcenter in I guess it's in St. John's in Newfoundland. And Mr. Speaker, you know, search and rescue is a serious subject. And I don't know if the honourable members ever had to depend on search and rescue or ever seen search and rescue at work, but I have. And I can tell you, I don't care where the phone call comes from at all. I want to make sure that a boat or a chopper or a plane can get out there. That's the whole purpose of search and rescue. It's not about who makes the call, who receives the call. And if you've ever been in Halifax, in the Search and Rescue Centre, they handle everything from this side of Greenland down to the American line. They handle all the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But how can they do that if your theory is correct?
Okay, the honourable member for Random-Burin-St. Georges.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, the member opposite, and I do appreciate his question, has no understanding of the lifestyle and the impact in terms of having access to a centre like that in Newfoundland and Labrador. 10,000 miles of coastline. People working in that distress centre who understands what's happening on the waterways of Newfoundland and Labrador. But we're also talking about jobs being impacted. So if that doesn't mean anything to you, it means something to the people of Newfoundland and Labrador who are working in that distress centre who will no longer have employment. So that is a serious issue in our province as well. If you look at what's been happening in Newfoundland and Labrador, you've seen the number of federal employees drop progressively for the last 3 years. This year, there's a difference of over 200 federal jobs less in Newfoundland and Labrador. And this is going to create an even further decrease.
Hear, hear. Just another reminder to members to direct their comments to the chair. Questions and comments. The honourable member for St. John's South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The comments raised by the member opposite, he asked whether or not the sub-centre, the search and rescue centre, is in St. John's. Yes, sir. It is in St. John's South Mount Pearl. It is in my riding. I think you should know that before you stand up to ask a question. In terms of the member from Random-Burin-St. Georges, I congratulate her on your re-election to the House of Commons. Some comments were made about what exactly the search and rescue, what function the search and rescue centre does, what exactly it does. And it's the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans mentioned earlier that he called it a call centre, and it's far from a call centre. Not only does the search and rescue centre take calls, but if the personnel in the search and rescue centre, if they cannot raise the vessel, they also try to contact the family, the vessel owner, the whole 9 yards. I have a question for the member from Random-Burin-St. Georges. I'd like to know what the Liberals' stand is in regards to the call for an inquiry into the fall of the Newfoundland and Labrador fisheries. Will the honourable member answer that question?
Honourable member for Random-Burin-St. Georges.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the member from St. John's Centre, Mount Pearl, to this House. It's good to have you here with us. And I welcome this question. I think the issue for us is to make sure that the fishery survives. That's what's crucial here. We have to make sure that we do everything we can to see that that industry continues as a viable industry, whether that means some restructuring, but it's important that whatever we do, we work with the province.
Here, here.
Resuming debate.